Epstein Island isn't the only island out there where they have hurt you.
A whole bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand.
And I went, oh, okay. Now I understand what we're up against.
Jim Caviezel is not your typical Hollywood actor. He played Jesus Christ. He starred in a film the entire entertainment industry tried to suffocate before it reached theaters. And now, when every other A-lister in Hollywood is mysteriously, conspicuously silent, Jim Caviezel is one of the only people with actual public reach who keeps saying the quiet part out loud. The claim he keeps returning to is specific, not vague, not symbolic. He isn't saying the system is corrupt in some abstract philosophical way. He is saying in plain language that there are multiple private islands operating right now, or that have operated in recent memory, running the same kind of operation that Jeffrey Epstein ran on Little St. James. And he says the reason you've never heard of most of them is not because journalists didn't find them. It's because the people who own those islands also own the platforms that would report on them. That is a serious claim. And the question worth asking isn't whether Jim Caviezel is an actor with no intelligence background. The question is, does the historical and legal record support what he's alleging? Because it does, extensively. And we're going to go through all of it tonight. But first, let's understand how Jim arrived at this point. Because this didn't start in a podcast studio. It started in a movie theater in Las Vegas.
We had 1,500 patriots, the people that were interested in seeing the film in Las Vegas. During one part of the film, everybody in the audience started whispering. And of course you're watching the viewers to see if they're even interested in the movie, but they were very, very locked in. At one point, they all started whispering, and I thought that was... I've never seen that before.
Jim was watching the audience watch his film, and during one specific scene, the island scene, 1,500 people in that theater suddenly went quiet in unison. Not because the scene was boring, because they recognized something. They started whispering the same two words to each other.
They all started whispering, and I thought that was... I've never seen that before. So after the movie, I asked him a couple of questions, and then I had to ask him, why were you whispering at this one particular part in the movie? And I didn't pick up on it. And they all started screaming out Epstein Island.
That moment changed something for Jim. A crowd of over 1,000 people, completely unprompted, made the same connection. The island in the movie, the island in the news, they were the same story. And Jim began to understand that what his film was depicting wasn't just inspired by real events. For many people in that room, it was the real events. But here's where Jim didn't stop at Epstein. He pushed further. He looked the audience in the eye and said something that very few public figures have been willing to say.
Epstein Island isn't the only island out there where they have hurt you.
Notice the phrasing. He didn't say allegedly. He didn't say some people believe. He stated it the way you state something you know to be true. And that choice of language is either reckless or it means he has seen something the rest of us haven't. Now let's talk about the document trail. Because Jim Caviezel's claims don't exist in a vacuum. They exist alongside a document dump that the Department of Justice has been slow walking since the beginning of 2026. And what has already come out is disturbing enough that the 98% they're still holding back should concern every single person watching this. Earlier this year, a sitting U.S. congressman obtained access to unredacted portions of the Epstein files. What he found inside wasn't just gossip. It was correspondence, emails, between Epstein and people whose identities were initially hidden behind thick black redaction lines. One email, dated April 24, 2009, reads with the casual warmth of two men who have known each other for years. Where are you? Are you okay? I loved the tea video. The recipient, a sultan, a man who runs a global logistics empire in shipping, ports, trade routes across entire oceans, the kind of man who moves things invisibly around the world at scale. And in a separate email, that same man wrote back to Epstein with a line that, once you read it, is very difficult to interpret as anything other than what it sounds like. When congressional pressure forced the question of redaction, when journalists and investigators pushed to have the sultan's name made public, he resigned immediately from his multi-billion-dollar company. He didn't fight it. He didn't deny it. He walked away from everything overnight. That's not the behavior of an innocent man caught in an awkward moment. That's the behavior of someone who knew the moment that name became public, the consequences would be irreversible. But what does this have to do with multiple islands? Everything. Because the Epstein operation wasn't invented by Epstein. He didn't come up with it. He inherited a playbook. To understand what Jim Caviezel is pointing at, you have to go back, not to the 1990s, further, to 1960, North Fox Island, Lake Michigan. A man named Francis Sheldon, old money Yale graduate, descendant of a former U.S. governor and secretary of war, purchases a remote island. He doesn't build a vacation home. The very first thing he builds is an airstrip. He calls his organization Brother Paul's Children's Mission. It sounds like charity work. It was not. What Sheldon built on that island was a sophisticated operation targeting boys from underprivileged communities. They were recruited, flown in, filmed, and the recordings were sold to a private subscriber list of wealthy men. The parallels to what Epstein would do decades later are not coincidental. They are structural. Same isolation, same wealth, same use of charitable framing as cover, same private clientele. When a gym teacher named Gerald Richards was eventually caught and flipped on the operation, he testified before a U.S. Senate subcommittee in 1977. He told them he had approximately 600 customers, all of them wealthy, none of them poor. And he admitted he was giving away material at a loss, just to maintain access to rich, powerful protectors. Sound familiar? What happened to Francis Sheldon? He fled to the Netherlands before an arrest could be made. The Netherlands had no extradition treaty covering these offenses at the time. He lived out the remainder of his life there. He died in 1996. He never saw the inside of a courtroom. Every single one of his victims waited their entire lives for a justice that never came. Now moved to a different island, different ocean, but the same pattern reasserting itself like a genetic code. Pitcairn Island, South Pacific. This is the same island where the mutineers of the HMS Bounty settled in 1790. For generations, it remained one of the most isolated communities on Earth. Population in the dozens, no outside oversight, laws that existed only on paper. In 1999, a 15-year-old girl told British police she had been repeatedly abused since the age of 12 by the island's mayor. What followed was called Operation Unique, and what investigators uncovered was not a recent crime. It was a pattern stretching back to the 1950s. A medical officer stationed there in the 1960s had written about it. A social worker in the 1970s had flagged it and warned London. And London's response both times? They sent pamphlets about health awareness. 7 men were eventually convicted. The community largely closed ranks. The isolation that had made the island a paradise for settlers had also made it a fortress for predators. Here's where the evidence stops being about geography and starts being about infrastructure. The Wonderland Club, not a single location, not one island, an international network operating across 13 countries simultaneously. And to join, you didn't just have to be interested, you had to contribute. The price of admission was 10,000 new images. That was the entry requirement. The network broadcast content live over the internet using encryption technology developed by former intelligence operatives. Let that sit for a moment. This was not amateurs in basements. This was an organized, encrypted, internationally distributed operation using tools that came from intelligence communities. The same communities that are supposed to be protecting children. Over 100 arrests were made, but among those arrested were not destitute men with nothing to lose. They were men with resources, men who could afford international travel, men who, in several cases, had professional lives and public reputations they had carefully maintained for decades. The Wonderland Club collapsed not because a journalist uncovered it, but because law enforcement from multiple countries coordinated simultaneously. It required that level of effort to bring down. A single country acting alone would not have been enough. And here is what connects all 3 of these cases, North Fox Island, Pitcairn, the Wonderland Club, to what Jim Caviezel is saying about the present day. Each of them operated for years, sometimes decades, before anyone was held accountable. Each of them had protectors, wealthy, connected protectors who either participated or looked the other way in exchange for access. Each of them used the cover of isolation, whether geographic or digital, to make oversight impossible. And each of them, when finally exposed, revealed that the people who should have stopped it, the journalists, the officials, the institutions, had known or suspected something for a long time. That isn't a coincidence. That is a system. So here's the part that ties everything together. Because you've been watching this and probably asking yourself, if all of this is documented, if the evidence is this extensive, if the DOJ files are this explosive, why is the response from Hollywood essentially nothing? Jim Caviezel walked away from the system. He made a film that studio after studio refused to distribute. He said things publicly that most of his peers would never whisper in private. And he's still here because there is a specific kind of person that system cannot fully neutralize. The one who genuinely has no interest in what the system is offering. The DOJ currently holds 98% of the Epstein files, unreleased. The 2% that has dropped has already implicated a sultan who runs a global shipping empire. It has already shown emails so explicit, they required congressional clearance to access. And somewhere in that remaining 98%, if Jim Caviezel is right and if the historical record is any guide, there are names attached to islands that most people have never heard of. The question isn't whether these places existed. The historical record proves they did. The question is whether the ones operating right now will be treated the same way North Fox Island was, the same way Pitcairn was, whether the people with the power to act will again send pamphlets. Jim Caviezel isn't asking you to trust him blindly. He's asking you to look at what's already in the public record, the court filings, the Senate testimonies, the international arrests, and ask yourself one honest question. If it happened before this many times, in this many places, protected by this many powerful people, why would right now be any different? The 2026 Epstein files are still being drip released. Pressure from the public is the only mechanism that has historically forced these things into the open. And the only thing that produces public pressure is people who are paying attention. So drop your thoughts below. Do you think the remaining 98% of the Epstein files will ever be fully released? If Jim Caviezel is right, and the historical evidence suggests he might be, who do you think owns the islands that never made the news? Stay on this, because the people who want this story to disappear are counting on you not to.